And welcome back to Face the Nation. To talk more about how to defeat ISIS and combat violent extremists, we are joined by Farah Pandit, who was the first ever State Department Special Rep to Muslim communities, is now with the Council on Foreign Relations. Michelle Flournoy was an Undersecretary of Defense and co-founder of the Center for New American Security. Danielle Pletka is with the American Enterprise Institute, and David Ignatius is a columnist for the Washington Post. I just want to go back to this summit on terrorism that we just had. And I wonder, how is it that we wind up the week in an argument about what you call these people while they're cutting people's heads off and burning people alive? And yet we seem to have bogged down into this argument over, you know, kind of how many angels dance on the head of a needle. Michelle, do we have a strategy?
I think we do have a strategy, but there are parts of it that have been underdeveloped and under-resourced. And I actually think it's very important that the summit was convened to focus on the ideology. This is not only about ISIL forces in Iraq and Syria, it's about their power to inspire others to be radicalized. So trying belatedly to try to put together a strategy that deals with the ideological component of this, I think, is actually really important.
I also think it's important that the president, you see it change in the trajectory of the understanding of the threat. If you go back to the Cairo speech, the word ideology and terror were not used. They were almost used 75 times last week in his speeches. Also, it was important that the president outlined both the violent and the non-violent ideologies that are part of this threat. And that's really important because it illustrates the importance of soft power and also the underlying ecosystems that allow the narrative of the extremists to thrive. The second point, though, about the summit is that it's an opportunity. It's to mobilize like-minded thinkers, both from the private sector and from the public sector, to do more than we've ever done before. Right now in the ideological space, everything is ad hoc and it's uneven. So this is a moment that we could capture.
Danielle, what was your take on it?
Well, it was good as far as it went. It's important that the president start talking about ideology. Farah's exactly right. He didn't like talking about it. It's a reversal from his Cairo speech, and that's a good thing. But this euphemism problem that you referred to, this is part of the problem. Somebody likened it to Voldemort. You know, he who shall not be named. We need to call it Islamist extremism, not because we want to call out Muslims or because we want to label all Muslims as terrorists, but because we want to identify this as a problem that countries in the region need to deal with, that we need to address. If we're going to have an ideological fight for the hearts and minds of these young people who are out there murdering, then we need to recognize what it is that's bringing them to the fight. And it isn't violent extremism that's bringing them. It's Islam.
You don't agree with the State Department spokesman says it's because they don't have jobs?
I thought that was utterly ridiculous, and I think that data would show that people join the fight not because they don't have jobs. Sure, there are lost young men and women who go because they're unemployed, but you know, you're not doing badly if you're living in Brussels or in Paris or in Manchester. Those people aren't joining because they don't have jobs. They're joining because this is an ideology that has appealed to them.
David, you were just out there. What's the latest news from that part of the world?
Well, I saw two things that I think are worth sharing with your viewers. First, I was in Iraq, and I saw just how powerful the push from Kurdistan now into Nineveh province, where Mosul is, other areas, just how powerful that is. Mosul is being squeezed. I worry that there's a rush to have the final assault on Mosul, but I'll tell you, being on the roads that have just recently been liberated, heading toward Mosul, you can see what a difference these U.S.-backed actions are making. The second thing I saw when I went to Jordan was just how powerful Arab Muslim voices speaking out against the threat from ISIS are. And this is crucial, and it's the reason that I think the rhetoric of this last week, although it seems like a question of semantics, makes some sense. I think the president at this summit was trying to make room for Arab voices, not blasting Islamic extremism, because he knows that the way that this war will be won is if Muslim countries take the lead. So let's not get in their way as they do that. And I began to see that in Jordan. Some recent statements from Egypt tell me the same thing. So we always ask, where are the Muslim voices? My sense is we're beginning to hear them.
Where are they?
So let me say something about the strategy to go right to it. To win the war of ideas, we have to, first of all, acknowledge that we can win it, which we can, because the solutions are there and they're affordable and they're available. But to inoculate the vast majority of Muslim millennials around the world, the one data point we have to absorb is that they're having a crisis of identity. That is the first thing. The second thing is that we have to have a strategy that is truly global. In the ideological space, to get to your point, this isn't just about one part of the world. It's what's happening around the world to Muslim millennials, and we have to connect the dots. The strategy has to connect what's happening in Central Asia to what's happening to the tri-border area, to what's happening in Brussels, to what's happening in Kenya. These things matter to millennials, and you can't win this if the strategy is only about the hard power war. It has to be about the soft power war, and to understand that the extremists are building virtual armies. While we are talking about the troops going forward, they're building armies virtually. So you have to go all in. And that's the bottom line here. You have to go all in and understand that soft power has to be deployed as aggressively and with as much respect as hard power. And it's beyond just a communication strategy with ISIS. This is how extremists are manipulating daily life and culture around the world that is changing the way millennials think about themselves. And until we address a strategy that has all those components, we cannot win.
You know, Michelle, you were a ranking official in the Defense Department. Many people thought you would be the next Secretary of Defense. You took yourself out of the running. But when Farah talks about connecting the dots and all this, it concerns me that maybe we're not connecting the dots within the government. I mean, this thing we had last week where they have a Pentagon briefing and they call in these reporters and tell everybody we're going to launch this offensive, we're going to have X number of troops, and did everything but give the time of day that they're going to launch the operation. And then we find out the White House said, well, we didn't know anything about that. I mean, of course, all bad ideas, it's, you know, all bad ideas are orphans. They never have a father. But how can something like that happen?
Look, I think this was clearly a case where the right hand didn't know what the left was doing. I think not only did the White House not know, I think a number of the key folks inside the Pentagon in both the civilian and military chains of command were not aware that this was happening. I think so. I think it was clearly someone's mistake. But I think it shouldn't obscure the more important issue is, do we have what's necessary to make the Iraq part of the strategy work? And the two things that concern me right now are the Iraqi government's over-reliance on these Shia militias to make progress in the campaign. We've heard that the head of the Iranian Quds Force, Soleimani, is on the ground working with these militias. That could very much backfire. And the second is the failure to fully include the Sunni population, to take the necessary steps to do that. Those are two things that even if we train the Iraqis incredibly well and everything goes according to plan, those two things could derail this, so we've got to be paying more attention to that.
But I think you pointed to something that's really important here, and Michelle reminds me of it when she talks about Iraq. The hard power, the soft power, the strategy, the ideological war, the idea that you can't beat what's appealing to Muslim millennials with nothing other than an embarrassment about talking about our own values, for example. All of these point to an unbelievable disconnect. What about Syria? We have Iraq, okay, but we're not actually doing enough in Syria. And even if we win, even if we take back Mosul, we've still got a nightmare in Syria that is the heart of fighting in the Middle East. Not to speak of Yemen and Africa and the Sinai. We could keep going. And the problem is all of this needs to hang together if we're going to win. Otherwise, you do end up relying on hard power because you've got an immediate threat.
But I think what Michelle is talking about here, sometimes it seems like the right hand doesn't know what the left hand. David, how do you have a summit on terrorism and not invite the director of the FBI? I mean, you heard Jay Johnson doing his best to try to explain how that happened, but I don't understand that.
The answer is that there isn't a good answer, and these are the kinds of mistakes that governments make. In my reading of history, they get made, especially in the early months and years of wartime. You look back at World War II, the number of mess-ups that the United States made on the way to conquering Germany is staggering. So, they shouldn't happen. The larger question is there a coherent idea about how we're going to defeat this adversary? And I think Michelle put her finger on the one piece that's still missing, which is getting Sunnis in Iraq, in Anbar province, which is now completely occupied, in Mosul city, in Syria, to believe that they're part of this coalition to roll back ISIS, that ISIS is their enemy. And until we see convincing evidence that that piece is done, inviting the FBI director, we'll fix that. But that big piece, conceptual piece, that's where I'd like to see our top officials working. Because if that isn't there, it's not going to work.
Let me just ask you specifically, and anybody who wants to answer this, please answer. Is Ashton Carter, the new Secretary of Defense, going to slow down the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan?
I actually think his statement in Kabul was very important, that the president's reconsidering the options. I think what's happening is a broader interagency discussion that instead of focused on the drawdown, it's finally focusing on what do we need going forward. There's still an al-Qaeda threat in the region. We finally have an Afghan government worth supporting. We have Afghan forces that are improving day to day, but there's still a threat. So going forward, what kind of posture do we need? And I think that's a different and positive conversation that's finally occurring and may well lead to very smart changes.
How long is it going to be before these Iraqi troops are ready to handle this?
It's going to be a long time. We need more of our own forces on the ground to help train them, to help with targeting. And I think that people are talking about May. I think that's completely unrealistic. Summer, after the summer. But again, unfortunately, taking back Mosul isn't even part of the larger challenge that we face. And if we over-focus on that, I'm afraid that we leave all these other things behind. Even the democracy initiatives that the president talked about, which have been systematically defunded over the last 6 years, all of this has to come together.
What's the most important thing we need to do right now?
An absolutely comprehensive strategy of hard power and soft power combined that is going to allow us to win. Otherwise, we're going to be doing this for more than one generation, as the president has talked about it being a generational threat. Right now, as we speak, the infrastructure has been built around the world for extremist narratives to thrive. And you're seeing that come out in a lot of different ways. The poking at the diversity of Islam, they are doing this in a really real way so that young millennials don't know who they are. They don't know how to look at their heritage in a particular way. They're absorbing a new kind of Islam to represent who they are. All of this is going to have an impact on our bottom line. And if we take our eye off that ball, we're missing the forest for the trees.
Is there realistically any kind of a coalition coming together here?
There is on paper, and there are plans for Muslim-led meetings that will drive this point home. But until you hear Muslim leaders say what President Obama said Thursday at the State Department, we are all in the same boat together. We're all going to survive together. Until you hear them say that forcefully, you should be skeptical about this strategy. As soon as that message is coming loudly from Muslim leaders, I'm going to think it's real.
This is the problem. The president was, in fact, standing there alone, not with the King of Saudi Arabia, not with the royal family of the United Arab Emirates, not with the Kuwaitis, alone. And as long as they're not part of this discussion, as long as they can, with one hand, continue to support extremism like the Qataris, and with the other propitiate the Americans, you're going to have a big problem. I agree with you entirely.
But I do think we are seeing a turning point. After the barbaric burning of the Jordanian pilot alive by ISIL, the reaction, the spontaneous and real reaction across the Gulf to say this is not the Islam that we know, this is not something we are willing to support, the courageous steps that the King of Jordan has taken, and many other voices starting to speak out. I actually think that's an important potential turning point.
But it's the sustainability of that emotion. And that's what I'm saying. Everything has been uneven and ad hoc. It has to be sustained and real.
We're playing their game. That's the problem. The reaction was to the immolation of that Jordanian pilot, not to the rise of ISIS, not to the spread of ISIS. And you cannot rely on the enemy to dictate what our allies are going to do. This is a matter of principle or not having the principle, and I worry about these countries a lot.
we have to stop there. Thank you all very much for a
Thank you.
great discussion. I'm going to talk to former President Obama presidential advisor David Axelrod when we come back.
This portion of Face the Nation is sponsored by Audi, Truth in Engineering.
And joining us now is the longtime confidant of Barack Obama, longtime political advisor, David Axelrod. He has just written a book called Believer. It debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list this week. And it's a good book, David. I think it's a valuable addition
Thank you.
to document what this president's about and so forth. Let me just ask you this. Why is there so much confusion now about what this president believes, what he stands for? He has said himself he's not very good at the optics of all of this, but what's happened here?
You know, it's interesting. I always believe that the last president kind of sets the terms of the next election. And the last president was a very Manichaean kind of guy, black and white, saw the world in those terms. America wanted someone who saw the gray, who saw the nuances, who understood the complexities of the world, and who made decisions that had and think about the long term and not just the next step. And that's what they got in Barack Obama. So I don't know, I don't know why there is confusion. I think that there is nuance and there is an ability to see gray, which is really important in the world in which we live. That's true on foreign policy and national security. It's also true on domestic policy. He thinks several steps ahead.
But you know the criticism. You know what I'm talking about. People say he presents problems in the abstract, like a law professor. I think that's what Leon Panetta said, and more sometimes with logic rather than sometimes.
Logic is underrated.
Passion.
Logic is underrated, I think, Bob. You know, I heard Leon say that, and I was really surprised by it because I was there and I saw this president make a series of decisions about the economy, each of which were as unpopular as they were necessary. I write about that in my book, and was willing to do it because he thought it was the right thing for the country. Some folks in this town have a hard time processing that. I know he took on health care. I and others told him that this was going to be a political quagmire for him, but he felt it had to be done. And I know Chuck Schumer and some others have said that that was a bad political decision, but it wasn't a bad decision for the 13 million people who have insurance today and others who will benefit in the future, and that's what he was thinking about.
Do you think, in retrospect, that he went about it in the wrong way, in the sense of Lyndon Johnson broke the civil rights bills into 2 bills, the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65, and the reason that he did is he just didn't think the country could swallow that much in one gulp, and I think that was a wise decision. Would he, in retrospect, would you all have been better to break this into 2 bills, find something that everybody could agree on, pass that into law?
I think it's unlikely that the second piece would have happened. Remember, 7 presidents had tried this, 7 presidents had failed. And so there wasn't any blueprint that would suggest there was an easy way to do it. And he had big majorities in the Congress in the first term. We tried to forge a bipartisan coalition. He waited 6 months to try and put that coalition together. I wrote about that. He said he was willing to allow Olympia Snowe to move into the White House and said he'd take an apartment if she would sponsor the bill. and we just couldn't forge that. But I think that he did it the only way he could, by going for it at once.
Why is he had such a hard time connecting with people on Capitol Hill, and not just in one party but in both?
Yeah. I think everybody's strength is their weakness. His strength is that he believes that there are more important things than winning elections. He thinks that when you get elected, your role is to try and get big things done. That's not the prevailing view among a lot of folks in this town. I wrote in the book about right after the health care, when he was talking to the caucus about the health care bill, Democratic caucus in the Senate, we went back to the White House and he's in the car and he says, "What are they so afraid of?" And I said, well, I think they're afraid of losing their jobs. And he said, what's the point of being up here for 30 years if you don't do anything? And I said, look, I think they want to do something, but if it's a choice between that and being up here for 30 years, they'd rather be up here for 30 years. He hasn't fully related to that, and sometimes there's an air of moral superiority that creeps in because he feels like we have a responsibility to do big things. Why don't you see it the way I see it?
Mm-hmm. Do you think Hillary Clinton is inevitable?
Well, inevitable is a very tough word, and I actually think that's a trap for her. I think she is highly likely to be the Democratic nominee. I can't see another scenario, but this is exactly what got her in trouble the last time, because with inevitability comes caution, and she was unwilling to be venturesome and to really be revealing of herself and really connecting with people. Only after she lost the Iowa caucuses did we see that person emerge. It's important for her to come out that way, this time for her to be ultimately successful.
You really didn't want her in the Obama administration.
Well, I was wondering how this was going to work after a 2-year, very, very pitched battle, and the president had every confidence. He said she was a friend before, and she'll be loyal. And he felt like he was going to be focused on the economy. He needed someone who would be recognized in foreign capitals as the A team. And what was one of the nice stories of the administration when I was there was the relationship they developed, which was very respectful and very positive.
David Axelrod, we want to thank you, and we also want to wish you a happy birthday.
Thank you.
Today. I've got one next week.
Thanks, Bob.
We'll be
Good
back,
to share it with you.
Thank you very much. We'll be back to look at some of the weather lately and what it's doing to human behavior. Stay with us. We see our job at Face the Nation as answering the big questions, the questions most on your mind. And I think I'm on safe ground here when I say I think the question most on your minds last week was this one. How cold was it? Well, it was so cold most of Lake Michigan froze over. It was so cold that Niagara Falls froze. No reports of climbers there yet, but they are climbing the waterfall in Transylvania County, North Carolina. It was so cold the Harlan City, Kentucky Police Department suspected it was the work of Queen Elsa of Arendelle and issued an arrest warrant. If you saw Frozen, you'll get that, and you can then explain it to me. Meantime, it was so cold in Washington, where cloudy skies can bring the city to a halt, the temperature dropped to 5 degrees, the coldest weather in 120 years here. That would have been a heat wave for the folks in Embarrass, Minnesota. It was 41 below there. That's actually a lake those guys are standing on. It was so cold, the mayor of Boston found it necessary to urge people not to jump out of their windows.
It's a foolish thing to do. And you could kill yourself.
And if you wondered why he thought that warning necessary, yep, it was so cold it made all of us a little crazy. Back in a moment. Well, that's it for us today. Thank you for watching Face the Nation, and stay warm.